Thank you, Whittaker. Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Columbus, an inclusive religious community of people supporting each other in our search for truth and meaning. I'm John Mallory Land, your volunteer service leader for this week. The flaming chalice is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. It speaks to us of reason, tolerance, and freedom, and also of compassion, respect, and love. May its flame ever warm and illuminate our lives. We're sharing today's service in video format only as we continue to do our part to help slow the spread of COVID-19. Please be aware that our target date for reopening, September 6th, has been moved. A new date will be announced as soon as one has been set. Under the circumstances, a number of our recurring activities have been put on hold. But thankfully, others continue in a modified format. Our Wednesday night discussion group meets every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. via Zoom conference for lively discussion. Our lunch group, which traditionally has met at the Mandarin Cafe, is also presently convening through Zoom video conference every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Please consider joining us at one or both of these events. It's not too late to join the novel writing group. If you wish to, talk to Bill Harlan. You can keep up with all the latest developments within our UU community on our Facebook page or by joining our Facebook group, and you can consult our website at uufcga@gmail.org. Please submit any announcements to Brenda by noon on Thursdays for inclusion in the service. And now, let us once again reaffirm the 7 principles which sum up the core values that we as Unitarian Universalists support and promote. 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. 6, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And 7, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And now, one of the ways we proclaim the vitality of our fellowship is through sharing personal joys and concerns. I'll first light a candle for any unnamed concerns or misfortunes any among us may be currently dealing with. I'll also be lighting candles for any folks suffering with COVID-19 and survivors of those who have lost the battle. I'll light a candle for all frontline caregivers and essential workers in this time of distress. And I'll light a candle for those peacefully struggling to bring about greater equity and for those responsible for keeping all of us safe. And this week we have a joy to share with everyone. One of our own, John Studstill, has a brand new baby granddaughter. Her name is Rue Eris Wilson, and she's a happy, healthy baby. Congratulations, John. Our celebration of Live Toast unique to this fellowship, carries no doctrinal symbolism. It's simply a warm tradition that we invite you to share with us. Let's lift our cups as I read the toast, and we'll recite the last line together. We celebrate life with its beauty and its pain. We lift these cups in tribute to the achievements of human minds and hands, and in sensitivity to the frustrations of misfortune and heartache. Not fixing blame or credit for the outcome of chance, sensing the risk, savoring the joy, sharing it all, and knowing the certainty of death, and remembering the value of each moment. We drink this toast of celebration to this time, to the memory of our dearly departed, to the future, to each other, to the throbbing of the earth and sea and sky with life. Together, we drink this toast in celebration of life. This morning's offering will be given and received in the spirit of grateful fellowship. While we're all apart, there are two ways you may send your offering. You can direct a check by mail to the UUFC at P.O. Box 698, Fortson, Georgia 31808. Or from our website, you may navigate to PayPal, where you can use your free account to make a secure donation. If that second choice is your option, you may wish to include a few extra dollars to cover PayPal's fee. While we attend to that, we'll be treated to an offertory selection played by our own Whittaker Locke. Thanks so much, Whittaker. And now we have a reading from a member of our fellowship, Danielle Neale.
My name is Danielle Neale, and I would like to share with you a reading by Erik Martinez Resly called Found While Lost. The beauty of the world is the mouth of a labyrinth, writes Simon Weil. We would be foolish not to follow its call, and so we enter the labyrinth, lured by the whiff of a dream still in the making, the possibility of a new relationship, the promise of a new career, the potential for a new beginning. We can never be sure what we will find once inside, but this much is certain. There will be times when the beauty of the world, and with it the entrance to the labyrinth, unexpectedly disappear. Some relationships will disintegrate, some careers will dissatisfy, some beginnings will disappoint. Unable to find the labyrinth's opening, we often find ourselves in frantic search of an escape, fumbling for the next step, tiring ourselves out in the process. Disheartened, dispirited, we feel disoriented. We get lost. The question is not whether we will get lost in life, but rather how we will move through it in faith. Will we dwell on everything that we have lost, or will we focus instead on everything that we have yet to find? As it happens, there is much that awaits us in our lostness, much to be excavated, examined, even exalted. In not knowing yet what will be, we are afforded the opportunity to appreciate what already is. The things hiding in plain sight. A frayed relationship, for example, may reveal our deeper needs. An unfulfilling career may motivate us to seek a mentor. A misstart or a misstep may remind us of our own fragile humanity. It may claw open our hearts and sensitize us to the suffering of others. When lost, perhaps the greatest question our faith asks us is this: how will we be found? Once the time is ripe, the stars align, and the way begins to open, will we be ready to embrace the mystery anew? Will we choose to trust anew, to risk anew, to hope anew? Will we allow ourselves to yet again be drawn in, swept up, taken over by that magic that makes life worth living? In the words of Simon Weil, "For if we do not lose courage, if we go on walking, it is absolutely certain that we will finally arrive at the center of the labyrinth." Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy your Sunday.
Thanks so much for that, Danielle. That was fantastic. Our talk today is titled, Our New Normal for the Post-COVID Age. Let's think back to January 1st of this year. I chose that date not because there's anything particularly remarkable about it. It's just a day when we're normally looking ahead to the coming year. So let's do that. Let's put ourselves back on January 1st, 2020. How many of us anticipated that we would be in our current state of affairs as we are today in our lives and our environment? Not me. For some of us, our circumstances are probably more dire than for others, but we're all pretty much living in a different world than we could have anticipated on that day some months ago. Granted, a global pandemic of this magnitude we're experiencing doesn't come along often, so we can be forgiven for not expecting that. But it just illustrates the folly of trying to predict the future. While some aspects of our lives we can anticipate with relative confidence, there are plenty of other facets that we have no way of knowing ahead of time, or in some instances we may fail to notice or recognize the signs ahead of time. That said, today we're going to try to take a look ahead and contemplate what may be down the road for us, and what current trends or developments that we may consider temporary may turn out to persist longer term. I suspect that even at this point, a number of months into the crisis, we still have a tendency to picture ourselves returning to what we considered normal in the pre-COVID era. Once a vaccine comes into widespread use, or once we attain the elusive herd immunity. But increasingly, we're hearing prognostications that some aspects, perhaps many aspects of our lives, have already been altered permanently, even if we don't realize it. As we find ourselves steeped in both the pandemic crisis and the accompanying economic implosion, with no clear end to the situation in sight, our notion of a potential turning point on the horizon is tied to the goal of a vaccine. But the target date when we might expect to see the widespread distribution of a vaccine that's been proved safe and effective varies quite a bit. Political expediency has artificially drawn that target date closer, like earlier than the new year, even before the general elections. But a more realistic window pushes the likely date further into the distance, potentially into the middle of 2021 or later. It was a different day and age then, but following the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, it wasn't until the end of the mid to late 30s that a vaccine was achieved. And the flu is still with us here today. Because of the flu virus's tendency to mutate, manufacturers must try to anticipate every year what strain will predominate and adjust the vaccine to repel that strain, with more success in some flu seasons than in others. While the novel coronavirus also mutates, it doesn't seem to do so as rapidly as the flu, thankfully. With regard to HIV, while there are relatively effective treatments available now, there is still no vaccine some 40 years after that virus was first recognized in the US. Not to mention that, even when we do have a safe, effective vaccine for COVID-19, widely available, not everyone is likely to avail themselves of it. Between adults who are leery of vaccines and parents who refuse to get their children immunized, we may be required to continue other containment measures, such as mask wearing and distancing, unless and until the fabled herd immunity is attained. As long as uncontrolled spread continues in this country, some things are unlikely to change. For instance, we can expect bans on non-essential travel of Americans abroad to continue. Some domestic industries that are basically in a holding pattern until a vaccine makes it safe to resume a range of activities have set artificial dates when they anticipate reopening, like Broadway aiming to open back up around the first of the year. But that date is really just a guess, and likely to be pushed back as long as there are no remedy to the risk of packing patrons into a theater and packing a cast, crew, and staff on stage and behind the scenes. Meanwhile, in those locations where schools, sporting events, and non-essential businesses like bars and clubs have reopened, spurred in many cases by political pressure or agitation from certain impatient segments of the community, and largely against the recommendations of health experts, the results have been problematic, often with forced reclosures or postponements because of the renewed incidence of infection spread. Personally, I've been bewildered that school districts and institutions of higher learning, which are presumably governed by intelligent, educated people, have seemingly disregarded recommendations from health experts and pushed to reopen, in many instances seeming to give only cursory credence to necessary precautions with predictably disastrous results. The argument that students can't learn without in-person instruction and interaction at school seems questionable. Remember when homeschooling became a big deal? But even if we accept for the sake of argument that virtual teaching can't do all that in-person instruction can, recognizing also that not all students have equal access to the necessary technology, and children of working parents may be left on their own if they're schooling from home. The fact is that public health and safety is critical at the moment, and matters that are important and desirable must nevertheless yield to the overarching priority, which is to get the virus in check and keep it there until a viable vaccine can alter the dynamic. It seems pretty consistent that when education experts delineate the importance of getting kids back into the classroom, they emphasize that what they mean is getting the kids back in the classroom safely. That part seems to get dropped out of the argument by impatient advocates too often. So, for the time being, we may continue to see a nationwide game of whack-a-mole in which communities bring the spread of the virus under control or to some extent or other, reopen with social distancing measures in place, but experience non-compliance among some, which leads to an uptick in spread and likely the necessity for reinstituting some restrictions. Or another damaging alternative, simply remaining open and allowing the most vulnerable among us, such as our minority communities, to bear a disproportionate brunt of the resulting suffering and death. Some experts have warned that we could not only see a persistence of COVID in the autumn, but a significant resurgence likely to be compounded by the regular flu season. So it seems our altered way of life is unlikely to end soon. Meanwhile, our world is being reshaped all around us. Innovations that already existed but were not in nearly such extensive use, such as video conferencing, not only for work meetings but also for instruction, worship, gatherings of civic groups, and socializing, to some extent will probably be a permanent shift. We may not rely on them as heavily once we don't have to, but they're likely to continue to play a greater role in our lives going forward. Reliance on online shopping was already popular and increasing, but the pandemic has accelerated that trend. As more folks become comfortable and increasingly reliant on the online model, while in the meantime brick and mortar stores and chains continue to be closed, it doesn't seem unreasonable to suppose that there will be less demand for in-person retail as the economy recovers, which could be anticipated to shift jobs from a physical presence in a store to warehouses or even to online customer service positions that could be filled virtually anywhere that has internet access. Telecommuting and work shift staggering are certainly not new concepts. Both of these have been promoted in the past to help us cut down on transportation emissions and reduce congestion on highways at so-called rush hour. But these have found new utility and approval with the need for physical distancing. Practices like telemedicine have also existed but had previously met considerable resistance from some practitioners and perhaps more saliently from insurance companies. Necessity has increased the use and acceptance of techniques such as this as well. Once all parties, including patients, doctors, and staff, have experienced the convenience and reliability of such arrangements, it may be difficult to shift back to the older model, and it may not make sense to do so. Restaurants. A lot of restaurants have been forced to close, and undoubtedly more will follow suit. In a lot of instances, these closures may have been intended to be temporary, but will turn out to be permanent. For restaurants that have remained open, most of them have had to adapt, increasing carry-out and delivery services, or even experimenting with alternatives like box meals for pickup and delivery that patrons can prepare in their own kitchen. When we reach the point that the pandemic is abating, the trend to cook and eat at home may wane, but it may not. Some people may have discovered they enjoy cooking, or that they can eat healthier, or that it's just plain cheaper to eat at home. It is a trade-off, though. Ambience is an important part of any dine-out experience. There's also a social aspect to it, and it's also nice not to have to wash the dishes, pots, and pans after you eat. Like a lot of aspects of our daily life, restaurants are not going to disappear, but our relationship with them will probably have shifted somewhat, even after the crisis has passed, and there also may be less variety of restaurants in our local area to choose from, at least for a while. Travel and tourism have been devastated. Some destinations are eking by and may bounce back quickly once the public begins traveling more extensively again. Others may have a harder time rebuilding their role as destinations. There's been a notable shift away from crowded destinations like theme parks and cruise ships to rural settings, national parks, camping. Sales of recreational vehicles has taken off as folks who can afford to opt to drive instead of fly and take their accommodations with them rather than stay in a hotel or motel. That's a great development for RV manufacturers and salespeople. not so much for the airlines or accommodations industry, or for the folks they may not be able to continue to employ. The live entertainment industry has to grapple not only with the question of whether events can be staged in a safe and health-preserving way, it also has to deal with the public perception. If a show goes on tour, will enough people feel comfortable attending? If audience members must be reduced so that folks can be spread out in a venue, will the audience be okay with that? And can the tour cover its costs and clear enough profit when a given performance can only seat half the usual number of patrons or less per performance? Some performing groups and venues are looking at the prospect of streaming stage shows, concerts, and other events, either live or pre-recorded, for ticketed customers to view at home. Marketing has demonstrated that in the early days of the pandemic, the public was resistant to paying to experience shows in this manner. But now that the pandemic has persisted with no clear endpoint in sight, folks stuck at home a lot of the time are missing attending shows and are warming up to the idea. Another concept that is making a comeback in some places is the drive-in format for movies and even concerts. Every cloud has its silver lining. There's been less pollution put into the atmosphere and less mass consumerism devouring material goods and yielding waste. The question remains, when the economy recovers, if folks will be inclined to go back to their polluting and consuming ways, or if they'll have the disposable resources to even do so. Worship, another silver lining around this cloud for our own UU fellowship, is that some among us had advocated for a while that we generate video recordings like this one of our Sunday services to post for those who couldn't attend or live out of the geographic area, or who want to revisit a service later. But it wasn't until the pandemic kept us from meeting in person that necessity precipitated our creating weekly videos. This is one method of coping with the challenge that I hope will continue once we're able to resume meeting in person. Way to go, Bill. I've heard reference recently to estimates that as much as 42% of jobs have been lost during the pandemic are permanently gone and will not be there once we're through this crisis. Taking into consideration that 67% of all statistics are made up on the spot, nevertheless, it doesn't seem surprising that with all the business closures and with reduced income for so many households, in turn resulting in curtailed consumer spending, that the market would not be able to support nearly as many employment positions post-COVID. If unemployment remains high, it seems a danger that calls for a shift to a higher living wage level of pay might go unheeded. Wages instead could stagnate or even drop, driven by an oversupply of potential workers versus the number of available jobs. Not surprisingly, demand for business wear is way down as the result of increased unemployment and so many folks working from home in their jammies. If the trend of telecommuting continues beyond the period of the pandemic, as it may be that even with reduced unemployment, the weaker demand on business attire may also persist. The concern that another pandemic may arise could lead businesses to keep certain practices in place. For instance, plexiglass partitions between clerks and customers in stores, at least for a while. It can be difficult to anticipate what may catch on and what may fall by the wayside. But we must be careful not to make assumptions or jump to conclusions. For instance, it's a widely embraced misconception that hoarding behavior was inspired in persons who experienced the Great Depression, or that those folks even passed this trait on to their children. People have hoarded in a responsible way, and others have hoarded compulsively before and since the Great Depression for reasons that are wholly unrelated to that event. So we mustn't give in to the temptation to conflate correlation with causality, or assign either blame or credit to the pandemic for things that likely would have come about anyway. That said, some people's attitude and behavior is likely to change long term, not necessarily because the threat of COVID-19 is never ending, which it won't be because it's likely to be at least significantly reduced once there's a vaccine. But there is likely to be a lingering apprehension that a similar event could strike again. After all, we can remember outbreaks either domestically or abroad of Ebola, West Nile, Zika, and so forth. And while we'd like to think that our government and society will have learned valuable lessons from this pandemic that will guide future preparation, we realize that there was a plan and commission dedicated to anticipating just such an event, which were largely ignored and scrapped by an administration with other priorities. While it's likely to be detrimental for folks to live in unnecessary fear or dread, it's positive to anticipate disaster and be prepared for emergencies. On the positive side, there may be a shift in public support on some issues, such as moving away from health insurance that's tied to our employment. What a disaster that system has been for millions of folks who lost their jobs as the result of the pandemic. There may be increased appreciation for the role government can and should play, not only during a time of crisis, but in assisting folks to live a better life day to day. People may more readily understand the importance of cooperation among nations in order to be better prepared to confront a global challenge like a pandemic. There is a certain tendency in human nature to forget over time, though. I grew up in Texas, and occasionally, just occasionally, we would get an ice storm. The ice would accumulate on the tree limbs hanging over the power lines. The limbs would break under the weight and take the power lines right down with them. It happens here too. Bad news in the middle of winter. So the power company would not only go around and repair all those power lines, but they would also institute a robust, proactive flurry of trimming all the tree limbs hanging over the power lines. And they'd be quite diligent about it for a while, but over time they would become more and more lax about it. And by the time the next ice storm came around, some years down the road, lots of power lines had ice-laden tree limbs falling on them again. It's a lesson that gets learned over and over again. One lesson I hope this pandemic and the governmental response to it in this country may teach us is helping to slow or even reverse the decades-long trend for many to disregard or discount the role the government can and should play in promoting the public welfare, not only during crises, but day in and day out. Once there's a vaccine, the hard work of restoring what we can of our economy and rebuilding the rest may be daunting and will certainly take time. Along the way, we can expect to see lingering unemployment, a marked rise in homelessness, perhaps increasing crime as more folks find themselves in desperate straits. Local public services, as well as programs to help those in need, will probably be limited by scarcity of funding, since business closures and reduced consumer spending translate into severely curtailed revenues for municipalities. However, the solution doesn't necessarily have to be far off in the future. Even without a vaccine, we can hope for improving testing, and if we can get enough folks in enough places to adhere to distancing measures and so forth, so that we get the spread down to a manageable rate, then fund and implement widespread contact tracing programs, it may be practicable to reopen more extensively with greater success in a way that's sustainable. But for the foreseeable future, I get a kick out of that expression. When I hear it, I think, just what part of the future is foreseeable, unless you're a medium gazing into a crystal ball? Of course, it doesn't mean literally seeing the future, but instead refers to what we can reasonably anticipate based on known factors in the present and past experience. At present, the future doesn't really seem too foreseeable. The fact is, while there are trends or developments we can anticipate with relative confidence, there's an awful lot that we still can't. Or, like the next big earthquake, we may be confident one is coming, but we can't really say how soon or far off it may be. It could happen next week, or it might not occur during our lifetime. And the point when COVID-19 is no longer the serious threat that it is today will come. But when that may be, I can't speculate. Smarter folks than I can make educated guesses based on the available data. But the fact is that no one can know with 100% certainty. Only time will tell. Thank you. We extinguish the flaming chalice here that it may glow gently in our hearts. May it light your path in these dark times. If here you have found freedom, take it with you into the world. If you have found comfort, go and share it with others. If you have dreamed dreams, help one another that they may come true. If you have known love, give some back to a bruised and hurting world. Let us all go in peace. And now, if you'll join me for our closing words. With unity of spirit, we go our ways in universal fellowship until we meet again. And Whittaker will play us out with a recessional hymn.